This time on Engine Masters, you're gonna learn a really cool basic combo for a 450 horsepower 351 Ford, and we're gonna show you the power of a single plane versus dual plane intake manifold. Hey, this is Engine Masters presented by AMSOIL, and if you're a regular viewer, you remember this little guy right here. This is the 351 Ford Windsor that went head-to-head in an earlier episode against a 350 small block Chevy, and the Ford won by like that much. You needed a micrometer to see how much it won by, but it was good enough to earn it a spot on this episode where we're gonna show you the power and tuning differences between a dual plane intake manifold and a single plane intake manifold. I'm going to explain all of that after we get through with the baseline, but first, I just got to tell you about the combination on this engine because we've really fallen in love with it. This is something anybody can assemble, and here's how. Start off with this rebuilt bone stock short block from a company called ATK. You can buy it from Summit Racing. If I recall, it was neighborhood of $1,300 or something like that. You could do it cheaper if you pulled a 351 out of like an EFI Bronco or something and gave it a dingle ball rebuild. It would be pretty much just as good as this. Then we go to the camshaft. Now what we have in here is a retrofit hydraulic roller cam. It would have been a little bit cheaper if we'd used the production Ford roller lifters and hold downs and link bars and stuff like that. The cam is an XE282RF for retrofit. You can also get an XE282HR for the regular camshaft, and it's a good tweener camshaft. It's not too big, it's not too small, and it works okay with the low compression ratio on this thing. It is almost 9.5 to 1. Really, I'd like to see it at about 10.5 to 1, but you can run it on dog water, any kind of gasoline you want. Now we get into the good stuff. The Airflow Research 195cc inlet runner aluminum cylinder heads. You saw us run these things on a 410 cubic inch Ford a while back, and they rocked. They're just as good on this thing. If you're gonna skimp on any part of this program, I wouldn't make it the heads because I think they're the key to how happy we are with the overall power curve. But it has other good stuff. All the way up top, we're starting our baseline with the Edelbrock dual plane Performer RPM air gap intake manifold. We've got MSD ignition. One thing that's really important about picking a distributor on a small block Ford is that Comp Cams in particular has a whole bunch of different camshaft cores made of different materials, and the distributor drive gear needs to be compatible with it, so you need to call Comp Cams if you're buying one of their camshafts and just ask them, what distributor drive gear do I need to use? Now up top, we've got my favorite carburetor, the Holley XP series. This one's 750 CFM, and this is honestly another place where you could probably skimp in this whole program and buy something like Quick Fuel Technologies carburetor, one of the lower end Holley double pumpers. You don't need the Super Trick XP, but we love it, as well as our 1 3/4 inch hooker headers. Now we're gonna hang all of this stuff on the dyno, squirt some AMSOIL into it, and once again show you the nice sweet power curve of this Ford 351 Windsor. Man, I'm just gonna keep talking about how this engine is like a super simple thing that anybody can bolt together, and the key to that is that rebuilder short block. It's just stock stuff, but you know what? This thing is still a pretty good investment. With all new parts from Summit, like intake manifold to oil pan, it's probably about $5 grand. So you wanna take care of it, and you can do that with synthetic oil. You might as well splurge, but the AMSOIL OE line is like their lower priced kind of oil, so you kinda have no excuse not to get some for an engine like this. All right, let's see if I can hit it. I want not one drop on the valve cover, and oh, fail. All right, this should be easy. I have a feeling it's gonna run exactly the same as it did when we did the Ford versus Chevy showdown.
I think that's the right manifold for the engine, honestly.
The dual plane?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Usually I'm a big, tall, single plane guy, but on a street engine, that's probably
Dual
correct.
plane. All right, well, let's fire it up. We already have this thing tuned up. It is in the exact same configuration that it was in that last episode where we ran the Ford versus the Chevy. And so we're just gonna re-baseline it here and see what it does. Okay, so we have a pretty happy curve here. We made 427 pound-feet at 4,100 RPM and a nice spread, 2,000 RPM later at 6,100. We made 430 horsepower, and it's just a really nice curve. That hydraulic roller is just doing its thing.
Yeah, the rollers have a nice curve, particularly when they have the right spring pressure and all that stuff's put together right.
It doesn't really get much better than that when you look at that.
For a really average engine, I think it's doing exactly what it should be doing.
Yeah, when we look at the torque numbers and stuff particularly, it's exactly where it's supposed to be for this size engine.
Yep, right down the middle of the road. So good enough. Let's go make more horsepower with a single plane.
We hope.
Yeah. You don't think so?
I don't know. I think the RPM's hard to beat.
This thing's gonna make 450.
Sometimes when we're guessing what it's supposed to do, we're wrong.
Oh, I'm confident this time.
This time you're confident.
I have almost 100% confidence.
Well, let's find out. Swap that manifold.
Our 351 runs pretty good, and part of the reason is this. The dual plane intake manifold. Actually, the high-rise, really good Edelbrock RPM air gap dual plane intake manifold. Why is it called an air gap? Well, check it out. If you look, you can see that there's actually an air passage underneath the runners here. They make another manifold that's just called Performer RPM, and it's really the same design but without the air gap passage. And in truth, on the dyno, they run almost exactly the same. These look a little bit cooler. But the important part is the design of what's going on underneath the carburetor right here. You can see that the plenum is divided in two, and there are literally two different planes in here, a high one and a low one. Each side of the intake manifold is feeding a pair of runners on the inside and a pair of runners on the opposite side that are on the ends. And so one side is feeding here and here. The other side is feeding here and here. That makes most of the runners longer. By runner, I mean the sort of passageway here that delivers the air-fuel mixture to the engine. That's called the runner. And if you measured it from here to here, you would find that on average, they are longer than what you'll find on a single plane. Longer intake runners tend to improve low-end power. Shorter ones tend to improve high-end power. An example of that is if you go back and look in like the Hot Rod Magazine archives at the super stock racers of the 60s, the guys who were building altered wheelbase funny cars and stuff. Remember those big, tall injection stacks sticking out of the hood? They did a lot of experimentation with those, running them both really tall and really short to change the shape of their RPM curve and where they were making peak power. In fact, that was the same reason why Chrysler made those big old crazy cross rams and stuff. Well, this is just another more practical way of getting longer intake runners. That's why I like that thing. But I am also a huge fan of the single plane intake manifold. Why? Because these things tend to improve high-end horsepower at the cost of reducing lower-end torque. But as a magazine guy like I was forever, you really like that big horsepower number for your cover blurb, and these things usually deliver. Let's look at why. First of all, it's got this open plenum design, more air volume available to every cylinder of the engine as the pulses and waves of resonance sort of move through the thing. It's a lot of rocket science stuff. It's more better for high RPM. But more importantly, the average length of all of the intake runners is shorter. Remember we talked about how a longer runner makes low-end torque, a shorter one makes high RPM power? That's what this is for in a practical, packageable size. This particular unit is an Edelbrock Victor Jr., which is their line of basic single plane intake manifolds. They also make like a Super Victor and some even bigger ones than that. The taller the manifolds get and the more the runners are standing up against the port and the more volume they've got inside them, the more they're for a race engine. They can accommodate bigger and bigger displacements, higher and higher RPM, but for an engine like what we're dealing with today, I chose the smallest of them, which is the Victor Jr. Actually, in the old days, there's even smaller ones like the old Tarantula manifolds and things like that, the Torquer 2. Those, unfortunately, are not a great design. If you're shopping for a single plane, I would go directly to a more modern design like this Victor, and we're going to show you right now exactly what the shape of the curves look like as we remove the dual plane and put on this Edelbrock Victor Jr.
This is ready to go. Now the thing of it is this Performer RPM is probably the best intake manifold for this level of engine.
It's probably the best intake manifold dual, as far as a dual plane goes, built in the last 30 years.
Yeah, but I don't think this engine really has anything for the single plane. We'll lose torque. I don't think we're really gonna pick up much upstairs. Oh, oh yeah, yeah. Once you get that hollow sound, you know she's ready to come up. Look at that. And what are you using here as your special sealing sauce?
Permatex Ultra Gray.
You know I'm gonna critique your silicone job, so really lay a bead on that you can be proud of. Oh, that's pretty good.
Sweet.
Oh yeah, look at that. This is a single plane intake manifold. It's kind of a higher rise design. It looks way racier. That's why I like it, but it never works as good on the street engine as the RPM. My expectations are that the other manifold is going to be a little better.
It's all dependent upon camshaft and RPM range. It takes a fairly special combination of your large cubic inches or high engine speed to take advantage of a single plane on the street.
Okay, we're gonna fire it up now with a Victor Jr. single plane, and we're anticipating that we're gonna have to retune the carburetor because the signal is gonna be less, and it's gonna pull less fuel, and it's gonna be lean. No. 13.8?
Yeah.
Were we far enough into it though to actually know?
So, I mean, my sense is that it's probably going to dip down a bit,
Okay.
but I don't think it's going to dip down enough.
It's got 68 squares in it now. What do you want to put in it?
74s.
74s?
74.
Bold. Let's go for it.
Gonna make a move, make a move.
Yeah. Come on, you guys. Am I doing this myself?
You can do it yourself. So what happened is we slapped the single plane on here and we tried to make a first pull, and the engine was running way too lean, even though it ran fine with the same jets with the dual plane. Why, Dulcich?
Signal.
That's it. Explain it.
Well, the single plane manifold is drawing from all 8 runners at the same time, and the way the pulse separation works on a dual plane, it gives a better signal to the booster and it pulls more fuel through the jet and out the booster into the engine. So when we change the manifold, we also have to change the jet.
Short version, the dual plane sucks harder on the carburetor, and therefore it pulls more fuel out of the booster with the same jet than a single plane would.
So we've got 74s in it now. Should be a lot better. I think the single plane might actually be better now.
Well, it's gonna make more horsepower.
Yeah, I was kind of doubting it, but while we were changing manifolds, I kind of bonded with it.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, look how great it looks.
Go. Pretty good. It made more peak torque than the dual plane.
I think it made more horsepower. I thought it saw
absolutely.
450.
Yeah. I think it's going to be really good. Call up the graphs. Let's check it out. You're going to overlay it with the dual plane. Boom.
Oh, look at that.
Yep.
Textbook.
Textbook. Interesting that right here where they meet up, it actually tickled a little bit of a higher torque number than the dual plane.
Gosh, that's a great looking curve.
That is really good.
You know, this is a case where honestly, I would almost give this up on this engine, a street engine, for all of this. I mean, if we look at averages, this is one that really has a much better average on top. We've seen it where it loses a whole bunch of torque and picks up this much for 300 RPM. And that's not worth the trade-off. This really is the exception to that.
Yeah, normally I say that dual plane RPM air gap is the perfect street manifold for anything under 6,500, but in this case, I think you're right. What we're seeing here is that this black line is the single plane manifold, the red is the dual plane. And so the single plane gives up a lot of power down below 4,000 RPM, but in this case, it's way more than making up for it up at the top end. What's interesting here is that the single plane made more peak torque than the dual plane. It made 434 pound-feet at 4,900 and 450 horsepower all the way up here at 6,100. We don't normally see the torque peak come up. Usually where it's rotating, pivoting that curve, you still see better torque with a dual plane, don't you?
Yeah, a lot of times this number over here will be higher than the actual peak, but this engine really is one that lends itself well to the single plane. And it's a small motor too, which surprises me. It's only 351 cubic inches.
I find that the 230, 236 hydraulic roller, that tends to be right at the point where you got to make this decision. It's like the cam is just big enough that it might like a single plane. It's not a foregone conclusion. And you got to decide what you're using the car for. I mean, if you're throwing this garbage in a tow truck, you would go ahead and put the dual plane on it. If you were drag racing it, you would clearly put the single plane on it.
Even on a street car with a stick or something, I mean, this would be a great intake manifold camshaft combination. It'd be a lot of fun to drive.
Yep.
It's not just a little bit of top end. I mean, that's a great big gob.
It picked up 20 horsepower. Sometimes we see
a good range.
8 or 10. This is 20. This is a big change. That's impressive.
What application would you not use a single plane? I mean, I can't see a cam any smaller than this actually being where you would choose the single plane.
Unless it's drag race only.
If it's a street 600 cubic inch engine
you don't
runs to 6,000, put a single plane on it. You're going to have all the torque in the world.
Yeah, I mean, what are you going to do with 500 or 600 pound-feet at 3,000 anyway?
Exactly, but on something of reasonable displacement like this.
Yeah, generally, in street cars, you say, oh, performer RPM air gap.
I always
standard
do.
Answer.
I go straight to it. It's just the one.
I think in this configuration, whether it was a Mopar, a Chevrolet, a Ford with this camshaft and this size engine and decent cylinder head, I think we'd see similar results, but this is pretty impressive. This is a big change.
A big part of this is clearly it was the intake manifold that was the restriction, and that AFR 195 head is really good.
It's a good head.
And so it was able to take what the single plane had to feed it.
Yeah, that's a really good power number for such a basic, like reman short block with a good top end and a good intake.
Pretty cheap.
Good
and
cam.
At 450 horsepower, you could put a 150 shot on this thing and you could run 10s.
Yeah. I think guys forget how much power 450 horse really is in a Camaro or Chevelle or something like that. I mean, that was a big block.
You old guys are plenty happy with that.
Thanks.
All right, victory. Let's wrap it up.
Yeah.
Okay, Dulcich.
What?
Conclude.
I feel completely vindicated.
What?
Yeah.
All right, that's funny because I actually feel a little bit shamed.
Shamed?
Yeah.
Why?
I always tell people that the dual plane is the manifold for a street-going average engine under 6,500. In this case, I would pick this thing instead. The single plane's the better intake on that motor.
Yeah, the reason I feel vindicated is because I personally always make the mistake of going for the single plane when I should be thinking about the good old dual plane.
Oh yeah, you're famous for putting, the smallest displacement engine in the heaviest vehicle with the biggest carburetor and the single plane intake manifold.
Right.
And I think what we saw here is why you don't want to do that. Because low RPM, that thing is favoring, and high RPM, you're going to want to get the single plane. But I've also been noodling around some other things. We talked so much in the episode about carburetor signal strength and how that is affected by the design, because what you'll almost always see, as a matter of fact, I think I've always seen it, if you take a carburetor that is tuned perfectly on the air-fuel ratio, remove it from a dual plane and put it on a single plane, it's going to run too lean because the signal strength is going to be less. It's like, have you ever seen where that's not the case?
That's every time, and this time the difference is so dramatic that, man, it could actually do some damage.
What was it? 5 jet sizes?
Yeah.
Six jet sizes. And so that's a big takeaway. But let's say you're an EFI guy and you've got injectors down here in the ports and you have nothing but an air valve up top. You've eliminated the problem of signal strength and the carburetor metering and all of that stuff, but the shape of that power curve and the advantage of horsepower on the single plane and torque on the dual plane is still going to be there because of runner length.
Well, I've actually seen tests that would support that, but maybe we ought to visit that in a future episode of Engine Masters.
Well, here's one thing that we've visited a lot is all of those new throttle body EFIs that have the injectors in the throttle body.
Right.
How many times have you seen that they just barely run right on a dual plane and that they run better on the single plane?
Every single time.
I don't know about every, but virtually every time. I think there's something about the fact that those throttle bodies are injecting the fuel instead of drawing it in, where they might hit the divider wall or the floor and create a weird distribution problem, whereas that's not as much of an issue on the single plane. So that's something to think about also. Is that all?
I think we've covered most of it.
Oh man, it was as simple as that. It's never that easy on Engine Masters.
I know, but look how good it worked.
Oh man.
It's just all self-explanatory practically.
We'll have to make it way more complicated, which we'll do next time. Hey, you know what? We're sponsored by Amsoil, which is super cool. We also appreciate all the help that we get from Holly with Mr. Gasket and Earls. We also have support from Permatex, Autometer, and Summit Racing. We'll see you next time on Engine Masters.
Here, let me do that, Steve. I don't want you to hurt yourself. You've got a razor blade in your mouth.
I'm going to hurt you.
Oh, you're going to stand back.